My name is Lauren, I'm 38, and I've always been the quiet one in the family. I thought maybe just maybe today would be different, but once again my presence seemed invisible to them. They passed the champagne around, skipping right over my glass. By the end of the night, no one was laughing anymore. It started with the sound of glasses clinking in the kitchen and muffled laughter spilling down the hallway. I paused halfway through setting my coffee mug in the sink, catching the warm glow from the dining room. The table was set with my mother's finest china white with delicate blue vines and the kind of floral napkins she only pulled out for special guests. I wasn't on the guest list. From my spot in the doorway, I could see Rebecca leaning in toward Mom, whispering something that sent the two of them into another round of stifled giggles. Dad sat at the head of the table, flipping through a stack of envelopes. The smell of roast chicken drifted toward me, buttery and rich. It was a familiar scent, but tonight it carried a faint bitterness, like something good happening for everyone else, just not for me. I cleared my throat softly, just enough to be heard. Mom's head turned slightly, but her eyes skipped right past me as if I were part of the furniture. "We'll need more chairs," Rebecca said, brightly looking around. But probably not. Her gaze lingered for a second too long on the empty spot where I stood, then slid away with practiced ease. I took a slow breath and stepped into the room, masking the sting with a polite smile. "What's the occasion?" My voice sounded even almost casual. Dad didn't look up from his envelopes. "Just some family planning," he said, as if that explained everything. Aunt Margaret, seated at the far end, noticed me. Her fork paused midair. "Sarah, dear, you should join us." Her tone was warm, but it also carried a hint of surprise, like she'd just realized I wasn't part of whatever plan was being discussed. I shook my head lightly. "I've got some work to finish." I moved toward the sideboard to grab a glass of water, passing behind Mom's chair. That's when I saw the stack of invitations, their glossy covers catching the light. The words Mitchell Family Celebration were printed in gold. No mention of my name anywhere on the top one, though I caught Rebecca's in bold letters. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder, catching my eye. "Oh, these aren't really for you," she said with a little shrug, the kind meant to sound harmless but land like a push. "It's more immediate family." I let the words hang in the air, not biting back, not showing the flash of heat rising in my chest. Instead, I sipped my water and placed the glass carefully on the counter. My eyes drifted to the clock, its steady ticking filling the silence that followed her remark. That was the thing about moments like this, they were never loud. The hurt didn't come from shouting or slammed doors. It came from the deliberate quiet, the unspoken rules everyone else seemed to know, but me. In the corner, Aunt Margaret's gaze flicked between me and the others, her brows knitting. I could almost see the question forming in her mind, but she didn't speak. And I didn't invite her to. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward the doorway, catching one last glimpse of their tight little circle, their laughter resuming the moment my back was turned. The scent of roast chicken followed me down the hall, fading with each step toward my room. I didn't close the door behind me. I just let it rest slightly ajar, the hum of their conversations spilling in like a reminder. Somewhere in the middle of my desk lay a small, unopened envelope addressed to me in unfamiliar handwriting. I brushed my fingers over it but didn't open it. Not tonight, not while the sound of my family's celebration echoed faintly from the other room, carrying the subtle weight of being left out again. And still, I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I already knew I wouldn't be standing in that doorway forever. The house settled into its nighttime rhythm, pipes ticking, the refrigerator's soft hum, the old clock measuring out the dark in careful beats. I lay on my back with the covers pulled to my collarbone, watching the faint square of streetlight glide across the ceiling as a car rolled by and turned the corner. Sometime after 2, a board in the hallway gave a tired sigh. I didn't move. I just let my eyes drift to the cracked line of my door, left open 2 fingers wide like always. The hall was a dim blur, the kind you only see after growing up in the same house, every shadow familiar, every sound with a name. A shape crossed that thin slice of light and paused, breath soft and careful. Then the door eased wider with a considerate hush, as if the person on the other side didn't want to wake a child. Sarah slipped in a step, then another. She wore the same oversized sweatshirt she'd had since college, sleeves swallowed over her hands. The hood was up not for warmth but for nerve. My tote hung on the chair by the window, its strap drooping like a tired arm. Her eyes landed on it. Mine stayed on the ceiling. She crossed the rug without turning on a light. The night offered just enough to guide her, the square of street light, the blinking blue of my charger, the thin silver edge of my vanity mirror. She paused by my chair, listening for the shift of sheets, the change in my breathing. I kept each inhale, even each exhale, slow. My hand rested under the blanket, palm flat against the mattress, as if pinning down my own impulse to sit up and say her name. The zipper on my tote answered for me, a small practical rasp. She didn't rummage. She knew exactly where to reach. Fingers found leather, then the snap of a wallet clasp, softened by years of opening and closing. I watched the ceiling square slide an inch as headlights moved outside and faded. Sarah's outline leaned toward the nightstand, where my phone pulsed with a sleeping glow. She glanced at me, chin barely tilted, then shifted her weight so the floor wouldn't protest. The camera woke at the raise-to-wake gesture. Her face, my face's echo, tilted just enough toward mine to catch a reflection. The screen brightened, then dimmed again, as she set it down precisely where it had been. Notifications slept where she told them to. It took less than a minute. It felt like an hour. She stood very still after that, as if testing the air for alarms. Nothing rang. No one turned on a light. The house kept humming its quiet song. She slid the wallet back into my tote, aligned the strap with the chair leg, nudged the zipper to the exact place it had started. Her hand hovered over the nightstand for one last pass phone charger, the paperback I'd been working through, the glass of water with a ring of condensation, and then she straightened. When she reached the door, her shoulder brushed the frame. A tiny sound, more touch than noise. She gathered it with a stiff spine and let herself into the hallway. The old board answered her again, the same faithful complaint, before the sound softened down the stairs and disappeared into the kitchen. I stayed where I was, my eyes on the ceiling square, until it looked like a window in someone else's house. A minute later, the front latch settled into place with a patient click. The refrigerator hummed louder, then gave up, and the silence that followed was the kind that leaves a mark. I sat up only after my heartbeat had decided to behave. The tote looked the same from across the room. The zipper sat where she'd left it, where I had always left it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and felt for the rug with my toes. The window glass held the cold of March. From here I could see the dark thumbprint of the maple in the yard, the street lamp throwing its steady ring on the driveway. No car moved. No lights came on next door. I stood, crossed the room, and placed my hand on the tote. Warm leather, familiar weight. I didn't open it. I didn't need proof to know what proof would say. Instead, I pressed the strap between my fingers until the nerve in my thumb tingled, and then let it go. On the nightstand, my phone gave a polite buzz I didn't recognize, and then fell quiet again. Down the hall, a faucet coughed briefly, then stopped, someone changing their mind about water at this hour. The clock in the living room announced the quarter hour in a low, wooden voice. I drew the curtains together and left the room as it had been. The book, the glass, the folded sweater on the chair, every prop returned to its place. When I lay back down, the mattress took me the way it always had without question. I stared through the dark until shapes learned to be shapes again. Somewhere between two breaths, I knew exactly what breakfast would sound like, the scrape of chairs, the innocent questions, the way my mother would ask if I slept well while refilling everyone's mugs. I pictured Sarah's hands around her cup, the faint half-moons at her nails, and the way she would laugh at something my dad said and let the laugh stand in for the truth. I closed my eyes and let the house do the watching. The card would be gone by morning, but the morning would be mine. By morning, the kitchen was already warm with the smell of toast and coffee. The sun fell in long, pale stripes across the counter, making the butter dish glow like glass. My mother moved between the sink and the stove, her slippers whispering on the linoleum. Sarah sat at the table, shoulders tucked, hair pulled back into a low knot. She smiled when I walked in, quick, practiced, easy to wear. "Morning," my mother said like every other morning. She didn't look up from the skillet. I poured coffee, listening to the familiar click of the toaster ejecting bread. Sarah's phone lay face down next to her plate. The handle of her mug was turned toward her right hand, though she was left-handed. A small thing easy to overlook unless you were looking. "Sleep okay?" she asked, eyes on the steam curling from her cup. "Fine," I said. I buttered my toast, slowly pressing the knife flat to spread the heat through the bread. Her gaze flicked up once, then back to the cup. My mother asked if I was working late tonight, and I told her I wasn't sure yet. It was all the same choreography, each of us hitting marks we'd worn into the floor. Halfway through breakfast, Sarah's phone buzzed once hard against the table. She flipped it over without reading, just enough for me to see the bank's logo before the screen went dark. A tight smile, a longer sip of coffee. My mother asked about her plans for the weekend, and Sarah launched into something about a hike. She wanted to try her hands making wide shapes in the air, pulling attention away from the small pulse of light her phone gave beneath her palm. I chewed, swallowed, set my mug down in the center of its ring on the table. The morning moved forward, plates to the sink, toast crumbs swept with the side of a hand, coffee reheated. The same sounds, the same light, the same breath of March air sneaking in when the back door stuck for a second before closing. When I left for work, Sarah was still at the table, thumbing through her phone, now chin in her hand. She looked up with that easy smile again, the one that asked nothing and offered less. I nodded a small movement and stepped out into the chill. The driveway glittered faintly with frost in the shaded parts, the maple tree throwing its shadow across the hood of my car. I slid into the driver's seat and let the cold leather settle around me. From here, the kitchen window framed Sarah's back. She leaned forward, elbow on the table, phone in both hands now. My mother moved behind her, saying something I couldn't hear, and Sarah laughed, a short, light sound that didn't reach the glass. I started the engine. The maple's shadow wavered over the windshield as the car rumbled awake. I didn't look back when I pulled away, but I kept the window cracked just enough to let the morning air in. It carried the faintest hint of coffee and something else quieter, harder to name. The kind of thing that stays with you long after the sound of it is gone. By the time Saturday rolled around, the house felt heavier, as if every corner was holding its breath. The sky outside was a pale winter blue, the kind that made bare branches look sharper against the light. I could hear my father's voice in the living room, deep and deliberate, talking to someone on the phone. Sarah's laugh floated in from the same direction, not loud, but warm enough to carry a message she was comfortable there. I lingered in the kitchen, arranging silverware for lunch, though my mother had already set the table. The clink of forks against china kept me busy, gave me something to do while I listened. Through the doorway, I saw Sarah on the couch beside my father, leaning in just slightly as though whatever he said belonged to her too. Her knees were crossed toward him, and his arm rested along the back of the couch, fingers tapping idly. They looked like a picture meant to be taken. My mother brushed past me with a serving dish. "Bring the bread in, would you?" she said. I nodded, picking up the plate and stepping into the living room just as my father ended his call. Sarah looked up, her eyes quick to soften when they met mine. "We're thinking of taking a trip," she said, her voice casual, as if the decision had already been made and my role was to be informed. "Dad says March might be a good time." My father cleared his throat. "Sarah's been wanting to see the coast," he added, glancing at her, not me. I set the bread down on the coffee table, its warmth slipping through the cloth. "Sounds nice," I said, keeping my tone flat, neither inviting nor resisting. At lunch, the seating fell into its familiar pattern, Sarah between my parents, me on the other side. Conversation moved around me like water flowing past a stone. They spoke about hotels, the weather-old memories of seaside towns. I buttered a roll and kept my eyes on the plate, catching fragments, early spring rates, quiet boardwalks, just the three of us. Halfway through the meal, my father asked Sarah if she'd like to drive his car for the trip. She laughed, said something about not trusting herself with it, and he told her she was more careful than most. My mother chimed in, certainly more than Lauren, with a smile that didn't feel sharp but landed somewhere close. The roll on my plate crumbled under my fingers. I brushed the crumbs into my palm and let them fall onto the edge of my napkin. No one noticed. After lunch, Sarah offered to help clear the table. My mother waved her toward the sink, and I found myself gathering plates alongside her. We worked in silence until she said, "I hope you don't mind about the trip." I didn't think it was a big deal. I rinsed a glass, watching the water swirl. "It's not," I said, but my voice sounded thinner than I meant. She didn't push, just stacked the plates and left them on the counter, drying her hands on a towel before slipping out to the living room again. Later, as the sun dipped lower, my father called me in. He was sitting in his chair, the evening news playing low on the TV. "We're going to book the trip tonight," he said. "It's good timing." I nodded. "All right." There was a pause, the kind that feels like a closed door. He turned back to the TV without another word. In the kitchen, the scent of coffee drifted from the pot my mother had just brewed. She offered me a cup, but her eyes were on the doorway, listening for Sarah's footsteps. I took the mug anyway, the warmth grounding me for a moment. Outside, the sky had deepened, the first hints of night settling over the neighborhood. From somewhere down the hall, Sarah's voice carried light, easy at home. Sunday morning brought the kind of quiet that feels intentional, like the house was holding its breath. I woke to the muffled sound of voices downstairs, the low hum of conversation paired with the rhythmic clink of dishes. Pulling on a sweater, I lingered at the top of the stairs for a moment, listening. "And if we leave early, we'll have the whole afternoon," my father was saying. Sarah's voice followed, light and certain. "That sounds perfect." I stepped into the kitchen to find them already halfway through breakfast. Sarah sat in my usual spot at the table, a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her, her hair tied back loosely. My mother was at the stove, flipping pancakes, and my father sat with the newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee. No one looked surprised to see me, but there was no space made either. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a seat at the far end. They talked about routes, attractions, even which playlist to bring for the drive. My mother laughed at something Sarah said, reaching across to touch her hand briefly. The gesture was small, but it landed like a weight in my chest. After breakfast, I found myself in the garage, sorting through boxes for no real reason. The cold air smelled faintly of oil and cedar from old shelves. Above me, the faint sound of Sarah's laughter came through the vent, an airy, unguarded sound. I picked up a box marked Photos and slid it onto the workbench, opening it to find snapshots from years ago. Family trips, birthdays, summer picnics. There were fewer photos of me than I expected, and more of Sarah once she'd moved in with us after her internship. I kept flipping until one photo stopped me, my father and me on a pier years back, both holding paper cones of fries. His arm was around my shoulder then. I set it aside, not knowing why. That afternoon, my mother asked Sarah to help her choose outfits for the trip. I was in the hallway when I heard them. My mother's voice animated Sarah's playful responses about colors and styles. I walked past the open doorway to see them standing in front of the mirror, my mother holding up a scarf to Sarah's neck. They looked like a scene from a catalog, warm, polished belonging. I retreated to my room and opened my laptop, more for distraction than purpose. An email notification slid across the screen, a message from a client I hadn't heard from in months, offering a potential project. My hand hovered over the mouse. It wasn't related to anything my family was talking about, but it was mine. A small spark, separate from the quiet I'd been pushed into. Evening came with the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Dinner was quieter than usual, not for lack of conversation, but because they were planning details now. Departure times, booking confirmations, lists of what to pack. I sat with my fork tracing the rim of my plate, nodding occasionally when addressed directly. After dinner, Sarah pulled out her phone. "I can book the hotel now if you want," she said, glancing between my parents. My father handed her his credit card without hesitation. She tapped quickly, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. When she confirmed the booking, my mother clapped her hands lightly. "That's settled," she said, her eyes soft as they landed on Sarah. The warmth in the room wasn't meant for me, but I stayed seated, sipping water slowly. Outside, the rain had deepened, blurring the streetlights into faint halos. I caught my reflection in the darkened window, still quiet, taking in everything. The next day, the house seemed busier than it had any right to be. My mother was in the dining room with swatches of fabric and a notepad, making notes about the table setting for the trip's welcome dinner at the lodge. Sarah sat beside her, scrolling on her phone, pausing now and then to show my mother a centerpiece idea or a floral arrangement she'd found online. I stood in the doorway for a beat too long before my father's voice startled me. "Could you hand me the toolbox from the garage, Lauren?" It wasn't unkind, but it was the kind of request that moves you out of the way without making a scene. I nodded and left them, the conversation resuming as if I'd never been there. In the garage, the light from the small window cut across the dust-covered workbench. I found the toolbox and set it by the door, then noticed Sarah's weekend bag leaning against the wall, new, expensive-looking, with a tag still hanging from the handle. It sat there like a quiet announcement of its place in the upcoming trip. I ran my fingers over the leather strap, then stepped back. It wasn't mine to touch. By afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving the air damp and heavy. I decided to walk to the small park a few blocks away. The ground was soft under my shoes, the benches still glistening from the storm. I sat under the oak tree we used to visit when I was a kid, my father holding my hand as we fed squirrels. Now the branches swayed above me, scattering drops onto my coat. My phone buzzed with a group message, photos from my cousin's family brunch, everyone smiling around a crowded table. I didn't reply. When I returned home, the living room was filled with open suitcases. My mother was folding sweaters, my father checking the car keys, and Sarah was arranging toiletries in a neat row. I leaned against the doorway, taking in the sight. The coordination between them was seamless. Each movement passed naturally into the next like rehearsed choreography. "Lauren, we left the vacuum upstairs," my mother said without looking up. I carried it down, setting it by the closet. No one noticed, but that was fine. I was learning to count the silences. Dinner that night was quieter, the kind of quiet that feels full. Between bites, my father asked Sarah about the presentation she was giving next week at her job. She spoke with a confidence that filled the room, her hands moving lightly to emphasize points. I caught my mother's approving nod, the small smile she tried to hide. I stayed quiet, pushing peas around my plate, not out of bitterness, but because there was nothing left for me to add. When the dishes were done, I lingered by the sink, watching Sarah and my father review the trip's itinerary on his phone. The low light from the lamp caught the gold in her hair, the warmth in his expression. I dried my hands and stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door, the latch clicking softly. The hum of conversation downstairs was faint, now a muffled backdrop. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at the small stack of photos I'd taken from the garage. My younger self smiled back at me, a paper cone of fries in hand, my father's arm around my shoulder. I slid the photo into the drawer and closed it gently. Some things I decided were better kept close until the right moment. The day of the trip began with a crisp, pale morning light streaming through my blinds. Downstairs, the smell of coffee mixed with the faint scent of my mother's lavender perfume. I could hear voices, hers, my father's, and Sarah's, low and busy. I stayed in my room a little longer, folding a sweater that didn't need folding, listening to the sounds of departure building like a quiet storm. When I finally came down, the hallway was lined with neatly packed luggage. My father was checking the car, Sarah adjusting the strap on her coat. My mother stood at the kitchen counter, sliding a travel mug towards Sarah. It wasn't just a coffee. It was a ritual, one she'd never done for me. I stepped into the kitchen and reached for a glass of water. "Morning," Lauren, Sarah said with that bright, polite tone people use when they're already halfway out the door in their minds. "Morning?" I replied, my voice calm. I sipped the water slowly, as if measuring my place in the room. They gathered by the door, my mother fussing over Sarah's scarf, my father holding open the front door. I could have stayed in the background, invisible. Instead, I walked toward the entryway and stopped just beside the luggage. My eyes caught my father's for a brief second, enough for him to pause. "Before you go," I began, reaching into my bag. My fingers closed around the envelope I had been keeping for weeks. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The paper made a faint sound as I slid it onto the console table. "This came in the mail. I thought you might want to see it now." My mother glanced at it, distracted, but my father picked it up. He read the return address, and I saw his expression shift, a small, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. He opened it right there, the sound of tearing paper louder than it should have been in the morning quiet. Sarah leaned over slightly to look, her brows lifting as she scanned the letter. My father's gaze moved from the page to me, and for a moment the air felt heavier. You got this weeks ago?" he asked, his voice measured. I nodded. Yes. He folded the letter back into the envelope a little slower this time. My mother's hand stilled on Sarah's scarf, her eyes flicking between us. The silence in the room shifted, not uncomfortable but charged like a current waiting to spark. "I didn't know," Sarah said softly, almost to herself. "It wasn't time," I replied, still calm. "Now it is." No one moved for a few seconds. Then my father set the envelope down carefully, as though it might break if handled roughly. "We should talk when we get back," he said finally, not quite meeting my eyes. "I'll be here," I answered, and stepped back, giving them room to leave. They filed out into the cold, their voices lower now. I watched from the doorway as they loaded the car. Sarah hesitated before getting in, glancing back toward me. I didn't wave. I just stood there, letting the quiet settle around me. When the car pulled away, I closed the door gently, my fingers lingering on the cool metal of the knob. The house was still and warm, the kind of stillness that makes you notice the ticking of the clock in the hall. I picked up the envelope from the table, ran my thumb along its edge, then placed it back down. The letter had done its job, not to cause a scene, not to force a confrontation, but to plant something that would grow in its own time. And I could wait. The house felt different once the car disappeared down the street. I could still hear the faint echo of the engine in my ears, but it was fading, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock. I walked back into the kitchen, set the kettle on, and leaned against the counter, the warmth of the morning sun pooling on the floor at my feet. I didn't need the tea, not really. It was just something to do with my hands, something to fill the quiet. The letter still sat on the console table in the entryway, its presence so slight yet impossible to ignore. Every time I passed, my eyes caught the crisp white edge against the dark wood. I thought about the way my father had looked at me, not angry, not exactly apologetic either, more like he was recalculating something he thought he already understood. My mother's silence had been even heavier. She hadn't defended Sarah, hadn't brushed it off. She'd just stopped. That pause was worth more than a dozen apologies. I carried my tea into the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, the one that had always been my chair since I was a teenager. Outside, the light was shifting, catching on the bare branches of the trees. The season was turning, and it felt like something else was too. By mid-afternoon, the house had settled into a deep stillness. I opened the windows slightly, letting in the cool air. Somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was raking leaves. I closed my eyes and let the sound drift in. That evening, as the light began to fade, I reheated the stew I'd made the night before. I set a single place at the table. Eating alone had never bothered me, but tonight it felt deliberate, like a quiet declaration. I wasn't waiting for anyone to make space for me here. After dinner, I washed the dishes slowly, the warm water steaming around my hands. I left the envelope exactly where it was, in plain sight, a reminder and a weight. They would see it again when they returned, and it would mean something different then. Later, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook. I wrote down everything from the morning, the look in my father's eyes, Sarah's hesitation, the way my mother's hands had gone still. Not to hold on to it out of resentment, but because I knew I'd want to remember the details exactly as they happened. These moments had a way of blurring with time, softening until they lost their shape. When I finally closed the notebook, the house was dark except for the lamp on my desk. I stood and walked back to the entryway one more time. My fingers brushed over the envelope, not to move it, but to acknowledge it. I climbed the stairs slowly, the soft creak of each step grounding me. In my room, I left the blinds half open. The streetlight outside cast a faint glow across the floor, and I lay back on the bed watching it shift as the wind moved through the branches. They would come back. We would talk. And when that time came, I wouldn't have to raise my voice or explain myself. The letter would do the talking. I could wait for them to arrive at the truth on their own, and that, I thought, was enough. The next morning began with an unusual stillness. I woke before my alarm, the pale light of dawn washing the room in muted grays. Downstairs, the house smelled faintly of last night's stew, mingled with the crisp scent of the open window. I made coffee, the slow drip filling the silence. As I sat at the table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the driveway. My pulse ticked up, but I didn't move. The front door opened, a burst of cold air sweeping in. They didn't call out my name, just quiet footsteps and the rustle of coats being hung. I stayed where I was until I saw my father appear in the doorway to the kitchen. He stopped when he saw me, as if he'd expected me to be anywhere else. My mother came in right behind him, her eyes flicking past me to the console table. I knew the exact moment she saw it. Her shoulders tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. No one spoke right away. The only sound was the clock above the fridge, each second landing heavier than the last. I lifted my mug, took a slow sip, and set it back down. The weight of the moment belonged to them now. Sarah appeared last, hovering in the hallway. She glanced at me, then at the envelope, then quickly back to me again. Something in her face had changed, not guilt exactly, but an understanding she hadn't had before. "Is that—" My father started but didn't finish. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. My mother reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing over the paper like she wasn't sure she should touch it. She didn't open it, just held it in her hands. I rose from my chair, moving slowly, my chair legs scraping lightly against the floor. "You'll want to read it," I said, my voice even. No explanation, no accusation. Then I walked past them, heading toward the living room. Behind me, the sound of the envelope tearing open cut through the quiet. Pages being unfolded, eyes scanning words, breath catching. I didn't turn around, but I felt it. I settled into my chair by the window, my back to them. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, lighting up the street. The air in the room shifted. I could sense it in the way their movement stilled, in the way no one dared speak for several long moments. When the first words did come, they were soft. My mother's voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know." I didn't respond. Instead, I let the silence stretch, filling every corner of the room. It wasn't a silence that demanded anything, not apology, not pity. It was simply space for them to reckon with what they'd learned. I reached for my coffee again, the mug now cool in my hands. My reflection in the window was faint but steady. Whatever came next, I knew I wouldn't be standing in the same place I had been before. From the kitchen, I heard the sound of the letter being set back down, paper against wood. Footsteps approached, hesitated, then retreated again. I stayed by the window until the light shifted, until the quiet became less heavy and more like peace. The letter had said everything I needed it to say. Now it was up to them to decide what to do with it. Weeks have passed, yet I still find myself noticing the smallest things, the way light falls across the table in the late afternoon, the hush that settles over the house at night. Life moves on, but it feels different. I don't look for explanations anymore, or for anyone to fill the spaces where words should have been. Some truths sit quietly, shaping the air between people without ever being named, and sometimes that's enough.